yeah, my mind's slowing down a little after day after day, is Thornley's testimony. And reading this first, you can then see more clearly than you otherwise could that it is a total fabrication. That doesn't need any more. That takes care of that. Let's see if I can dispose of the other document. Let's see if I can dispose of the other document just as briefly. It is important for you
Jim, by the way, I'm going to record this.
Sure.
Let the record state he said sure.
We're talking about a rough summing up of the Carrie Thornley. It's not the entire case because I don't have my basic file here, but what we've developed and put together from other files just in the last week or so, as well as information he's given us, puts Carrie Thornley into an interesting perspective. And this for the benefit of whoever, whatever you're going to do with that, that's the purpose of this summary. Now, the second thing that we don't have to go into in any detail now, but that you should read carefully on your own, is this gratuitous affidavit that Carrie Thornley gave me. That's very important. After you've read that and learned that the man is a pathological liar in the service of some clandestine operation, quite apparently connected with assassination, you will then get quite a bit out of reading his 50-page affidavit. Now, in order for the affidavit to be meaningful to you, I have to add one more thing, and we won't go into it now because that would just take time. It is important to understand, as you see the rambling in the affidavit, that this guy, although I would say there were slight signs of his being a bit upset, he wasn't happy at being called to the grand jury when we called him, was basically very cool. He, looking back, I would say, considering his relative youth, he had to have been pretty well coached by a lawyer because he was not at all concerned about any exposure or risks. He felt he would carry the day, and usually a layman witness is ill at ease in a grand jury unless he's had some lawyer really assure him that there's nothing to worry about. After all, a district attorney has a degree of control of a grand jury, and this guy's a stranger in there without a lawyer.
Did he graduate from the University of...
No, you find when you read that, that's one of the interesting things. He explained in the grand jury that the Spanish, which he gave us an eloquent sample of, he learned in college. But I found out again that he just, looking through that, he had 1 year of college. And there's no way the kind of Spanish you get in 1 year of college to be able to talk. You can read a little and that's it. Anyway, the point I'm making there is he was very cool, very organized, very much in control of himself in front of the grand jury, even though we knew he was lying. He did not know we knew he was lying because he did not know the statements we had obtained, the statements, for example, that indicated that he had been in Oswald's company here in New Orleans. Again, he told the lie, he told the Warren Commission. He repeated the lie and said, no, he didn't know he was in New Orleans at the same time as Oswald. He had no idea. And by that time, as I think you know, we had also talked to enough neighbors of the Oswalds down on Magazine Street to learn that they had seen Thornley. They picked his picture out immediately, ignoring Oswald's, picked Thornley's out. And I'd say at least 2, perhaps 3 different neighbors, where they thought he was Oswald because they would see him with Marina frequently going into the Winn-Dixie store. And so that and a few other things became the basis for the perjury charge afterwards. But as to the grand jury appearance, he was very cool and would have charmed the jury, except I think before we called him in, we had read some of those statements to them and they knew he was lying. Now, the point I'm making there is that when you read that 50-page gratuitous affidavit, which he gave me last year when I was speaking in Georgia, you'll see what is distinct deterioration. The rambling, it becomes almost incoherent. The story he attempts to put on me is almost unbalanced. In other words, the thrust of it, as you will see, is Mr. Garrison, I'm no longer mad at you. I realize that you had reasons for thinking I was involved, and it's clear to me now, but I did come across some things while I was in New Orleans that may be useful to you, and I should pass it on. And with that lead in, he then gives me a story that no child would attempt to sell anybody. Some Nazis that he bumps into, they're not just ultra-conservative, they're Nazis. And he overhears some of their plans to kill the president. And perhaps he should have reported that to me earlier instead of waiting so long. In other words, it's totally and utterly impossible. And in between are his ramblings. So, and the way, so as you see that, you must understand this is not the same Thornley as as the Warren Commission is encountering in April of '64. Nor is it the same cool Kerry Thornley that we are questioning in, I think, somewhere around '68. He has now begun some form of deterioration, and I would judge it has a great deal to do with the things he did in 1963, because you'd have to be really pathological to live with if he's done what I feel he's done. One more comment about the 50-page affidavit. The way it developed was I was speaking at Georgia State University, and just before the speech, the man that was going to introduce me said, you remember Kerry Thornley, don't you? Yes. Well, he'd like very much to speak to you. He's here. You mean he's a student here? Well, not exactly a student. He was a student, but he dropped out. But he hangs around the campus and he knows a lot of people, and he's very interested in talking to you. He says it's most important. And I said, in my usual tactful way, I said, you can send this message to Mr. Thornley. Tell him that the only reason I dropped the charge against him was because I decided that if they were going to let Clay Shaw go, then we may as well forget about prosecuting the smaller people. But I am perfectly aware of what he did in 1963. A very tactful message, one of my chief virtues, which probably didn't exactly do his psyche too much good to begin with. Well, when I finish making my speech, the young master of ceremonies is driving me back to the hotel, and he hands me an envelope and said, Kerry said he's sorry you wouldn't meet with him, but he anticipated that And in recent weeks, he's put together this affidavit because he wants you to try and understand his position, or something like that. So I said, well, I'll read it. And I read it that night and realized two things. Incidentally, in passing, as we drove away from the auditorium, he said, oh, incidentally, there goes Carey. And the last time I'd seen him, although, as you've seen from the pictures, what's the large picture of him with a woman that's standing up? Have you got that?
No, I don't have that one.
Well, anyway, you've seen it. He's very thin. He was very thin, but he wasn't noticeably sloppy. His hair was a little on the long side, but just in the sense of being full. I found myself looking at a beatnik of the lowest order. His hair, which was kind of a blonde, was now more of a reddish blonde and dirty appearing, and hung all the way down to his shoulders, but not combed, as if he hadn't combed it in days. He really, and he was also sartorially a mess. There's nothing wrong with blue jeans, but he was just plain sloppy and dirty looking. As a matter of fact, my immediate reaction, comparing him with the last time I saw him, even though he was casually dressed, was that he must be on drugs, because to let himself deteriorate so physically and in appearance. And I have no reason to change that impression. You know, some people, when they're fooling with pills and get far enough on pills, start getting awful sloppy because they're using downers at night, and then they're using the uppers, and pretty soon they become messes. You've seen, I'm sure, pretty girls become literally unattractive. Well, in that case, there's that kind of physical deterioration too. So I went through this thing afterwards, this 50-page affidavit, and decided it was potentially useful. I was struck by the admissions he unconsciously made, which I'll now summarize. But I was more struck when I re-examined it a few months ago and realized that it was more of a document than he intended to give me. Now, let me summarize just in this one-page memo I have, which I gave Gaeton Fonzi along with the 50-page affidavit from Thornley. I have, I have, do you have a copy of this?
No, I don't have any.
Yeah, it's in the copy.
I thought I gave one to everybody. Here, I have an extra one right here. No, that's a different.
Wait, this is in the Thornley file now?
Yeah, it should be.
I was talking about the affidavit.
No, I've had everything we produced by now in the Thornley file, so we have common files. You'll find it. But anyway, it says, Ray, 1976 affidavit of Carey Thornley. In particular, Ray, going to the substance of it, Bannister, Ferry, Mexico City, and Rosselli. And for the record, in case anybody has to follow up, I might add that his address, as far as determinable, is Georgia State University in Atlanta. It's in the city, and he is a dropout who doesn't seem to work, because I asked the fellow what he did. He just hangs around the university, which means, looking back, you recall that after the Warren Commission, he immediately left Washington and proceeded to an unusual school out west. So that was 1964. So that means he's now in his 13th year of college. and not even going to classes.
Did he have any previous ties to Georgia or the Atlanta area that you recall?
None at all. He's from California, literally from Whittier. That's where his parents live. And don't forget that his father's a photo engraver. That could be something to keep in mind when you're looking for one. It might be from an intelligent family. He went to school at Southern California, as you'll see in there, for 1 year. And as I recall, because of the incidents of young men coming in about that time, there were indications that some of the intelligence agencies were doing campus recruiting in the late 50s. And perhaps he was picked up at that time. In passing, it occurs to me that I think Gordon Novell was going to Southern California at just about the same time. And he ends up being a part of the same apparatus, but with a totally different assignment. Mostly, in his case, electronics and the bunker incident. Now, Thornley admits in the course of this, in between the paragraphs in which he's trying to convince me that he's innocent of involvement in assassination and that certain Nazis really were back of it, he makes these admissions. First, that he arrived in New Orleans in early '61. The Bay of Pigs occurred in April 1961. New Orleans, this is continuing my brief analysis which I initially made for Gaeton Fonzi of the 50-page affidavit. New Orleans was used as a logistical base, I should add logistical and intelligence base and training area for anti-Castro activities by U.S. intelligence in the early 60s. Example, the attempted purchase of a Ford pickup truck, that's at Bolton Ford, in Oswald's name while he was still in Russia. The training of anti-Castro guerrillas north of Lake Pontchartrain. I've come across some additional information this morning on that, but I haven't had a chance to get to it. I think referring to the location of another camp and another group of Cubans. If I can't get to it before you leave, I'll put it in the mail the next day or so. So that would be 2 camps located. Thornley, here's what he gives us. Oh, here's what we learned, and I added at this point. He's given us in the memo that he arrived in New Orleans in effect before the Bay of Pigs, apparently to join the apparatus and servicing it, and it would have been useful because his Spanish seems to be fluent. We know from our earlier investigation of Kerry Thornley, since we long regarded him as a significant figure, that he departed from New Orleans for Arlington, Virginia, to await his testimony in Washington before the Warren Commission. I have December 1963. That would be because it's in his statement, but the statement of Jack Spencer, which I will come to in a few minutes, has him departing much earlier than that. It has him departing literally days after the assassination for the Washington area. In New Orleans in 1961, according to the affidavit, Thornley, quote, accidentally meets Guy Bannister and discusses with him the book he's writing about Lee Oswald. This is the first of a series of encounters which are entirely too coincidental to be happening to Kerry Thornley, especially when you add to it the great coincidental encounter initially with Lee Harvey Oswald. In 1962, Thornley accidentally meets David Ferry. Quote from his affidavit, I'm nearly sure that no significant conversation transpired, unquote. In September of '63, Thornley visits Mexico City. Quote, example from the affidavit, "For many years I had wanted to visit Mexico City." 5. Also in September '63, Thornley is in New Orleans during the same period Oswald was. Later he says, "I began to realize that others might have good reason for suspecting me of being part of an assassination conspiracy," unquote. That's the understatement of the year. 6. From 1964 until June of '66, Thornley, and it admits in his affidavit, worked at Glen Towers Apartments in Los Angeles, where he got to know a gentleman named John Rosselli, who happened to live there. He mentions that they have conversations speculating about the assassination. At this point, I should say that back in 1976, when Thornley gave me this, John Rosselli had not been murdered yet, and quite apparently in connection with the possibility of his being called as a witness in the assassination investigation. And when you add that to all the other encounters, Kerry Thornley has bumped into too many people. He may be the only man in the world who has accidentally met Lee Harvey Oswald, Guy Bannister, Dave Ferry, and John Rosselli. Now Thornley is, at the outset, the point about Thornley is that he is the leading candidate for what has been for years called the second Oswald. I think some of us for some years thought that perhaps there were several alternate Oswalds, obviously used to set Oswald up by scenarios they went through. But for whatever it's worth, my conclusion now is it would have been more economical to use one man and safer to use one man, and they probably did use one man, and I think there are good reasons for believing that one man was Kerry Thornley, which is probably not unrelated to the fact that if he did that, that would be a good reason for deteriorating in the way he seems to be doing. One of the significant lies that Thornley told in the Warren Commission, the biggest lie of all is, parenthetically, is his portrait of Oswald as a communist. That literally made him the communist. I earlier used the analogy to the keystone of the Roman arch that holds the rest of it together. Thornley's testimony is the testimony in the Warren Commission that makes Oswald a communist. The rest of it is so irrelevant. You have people like babysitters when he was 4 years old. Thornley is what the Warren Commission is built around. As a matter of fact, I gave you all a little while ago statements of other Marines that lived longer with him and closer to him in the Marines, and one after the other says that he was not communist oriented in any way. But one of the most significant lies is Thornley's description of Oswald's height in his Warren Commission testimony. And this is very significant. They're both close to 5'11", to make that point. But it is almost impossible for a person who's 5'11" to think of another person who's 5'11" as being 6 inches shorter than him, needless to say. Yet in his description before the Warren Commission, he has Oswald as small as 5'5". He's asked by Jenner, was Oswald shorter than you? Oh, yes. Well, I suggest that that is clearly an attempt to disassociate himself from something. And what would he be disassociating from himself from here? from possible identification as the second Oswald. That, if he were, for example, that would be his chief concern, having to surface and testify. He wouldn't want that possibility to arise. Anyway, I compared their heights by...
Cliff, do you have this, and then I won't have to go through the whole thing if you've got it. Okay, then I just scanned some
I don't think we
things.
have that.
I want you to have it
We have
because...
this one, but I don't believe we have that one.
Well, I'll
Let me run that copy.
okay. In cases like this, I'll just summarize it, but I've given exact citations, one after the other, so in order to show you I'm not speculating that Oswald's 5'11". One record after the other shows that he's 5'11". Then, somewhere along the line back in the 60s, in the preparation for questioning him before the grand jury, we had sent for his driving license in California, and we learned from the driving license that he's 5'11". So, from the driving license of Kerry Thornley, we learned that he's approximately 5'11" and 150 pounds, and from the different Marine examinations and passport documents and so forth of Lee Oswald, we learned that he is approximately 5'11" and 150 pounds. About as close as two different people can be. Okay, now that we've made that point, we go on and go into the... It feels like getting me a cup of hot coffee and beginning to...
If they have any.
Oh, yeah, well, I've got to cold coffee than none, so don't empty it. You might ask the girl to bring it in if she's... That would mind her.
Well, I mean, if they have any coffee, I don't think any coffee.
Oh, really?
Jim, can we hold just for a minute?
Sure.
Some administrative details.
That those questions have been either handed to him before or asked to him before, because he responds so readily. It's almost as if in some cases he answers, "Oh yes, I'm glad you brought that up because that leads to something else I wanted to say." And he not only underscores by repetition, but he comes in on Oswald's supposed communism, Marxism, or whatever from different angles, as well as his rabidity.
What do you think accounts for why he gave us a smaller height? He obviously
There's
knows
a very
about it.
clear reason for that, Cliff, and you were out of the room when I explained, and that's why I went to the trouble. Have you seen the authentication?
I just picked it up.
Well, I think there's only one reason in the world for that. Now, naturally, you're asking me to speculate, and I identify the speculation. But this is the kind of situation in which you could stick your thumb in your mouth and say, well, there's no evidence to show us why Thornley made this man, who was the same size as him, made him nearly 6 inches shorter. And that would be the end of it. But fortunately, there's an approach to a problem like this, which I've described earlier as applying models. Now, if you apply, in the total context of the situation in which Thornley appears, especially keeping in your mind the additional things we've learned about Thornley, his rather pathetic attempt with the long affidavit to get out of this thing that seems to be closing in on him. If you apply a model, the applicable model, to Thornley, I suggest that the most rational answer as to why this man who is 5'11" describes Oswald, who is the same height, as being nearly 6 inches shorter. The most rational answer is that he played the role of the second Oswald repeatedly. As you know, the guilty flee where no man pursues. Well, put yourself in the position, for the sake of argument, just to see what your response would be when you were asked about the height. Suppose you had participated in setting Oswald up, and so much so and so consistently, for example, from going to rifle ranges before the assassination, shooting at the target in the next lane so that they were the Mannlicher Carcano, so they'll remember you the next day, going to downtown Lincoln Mercury and driving, I don't think they could have gone 60 there, but let's say 50 miles an hour or something like that, and announcing that you're Lee Oswald, and if they don't cooperate on the sales terms, well, you'll get a car in Russia, and having the salesman put down your name. The endless scenarios in Irving, going into the gun shop at Irving to have a gun fixed and leaving the name Oswald, and to the ultimate impersonation, which I suggest is going to turn out to be the 2 photographs of Oswald, to predict the likelihood that he will turn out to be the one who posed with the guns too. As a matter of fact, I'm locating some additional pictures of him. I was supposed to get them this morning, but with the passage of years, my contact couldn't lay his hands on them, but we have several other pictures of him coming. And we can really make a good, if we have about half a dozen different pictures of him, then we can make a really worthwhile comparison. But the point I was getting to in answering your question is, if you were the second Oswald, and you had played a part in setting him up as the worst villain in history by, and predictably and recognizably at an early stage setting him up. In other words, he couldn't, the second Oswald could not be doing what he's doing too many times without realizing he's setting someone up to be butchered one way or the other. Well, especially when it comes to the photograph, what would be your instinctive reaction if you're testifying before the Warren Commission and you're playing the role of being an acquaintance of Oswald and the Marines? Actually, you know that Oswald was in intelligence because he learned to speak Russian there, and you were in intelligence in the Marines. That's how you started, and you learned to speak Spanish there, and you also were associated with Oswald in intelligence activities in New Orleans, although you were here since '61 with Bay of Pigs and other activities, and he didn't come in here till the spring of '63. But the point is, if you had played a systematic role in setting him up, now you're testifying before the Presidential Commission that's looking into the murder of the President and the subsequent removal of his alleged assassin, Oswald. If they suddenly asked you, well, Cliff, how tall are you? And you'd say 5'11". And then suppose they said, how tall was Oswald? What do you think, in terms of probability, what do you think you would probably reply? Would you say, oh, he was almost exactly the same height I was? Do you really think so? Huh? You know you wouldn't.
Well, it's debatable because...
You would either make him 6'3" or 5'5".
Well, the reason I say that, the only reason why I say that, they know.
Remember, he's being
I
allowed to give an impression. They're not going, it's not like he's a doctor who measured him and he's going to be held to account for giving the wrong height. So,
right, but like I shouldn't use the word egotistical to the point that I would like to be as accurate as possible. Just for myself, just to show.
I suggest
Jim, excuse me, I think Jim's point is that if Thornley was in fact impersonating Oswald,
I know.
he was trying, what would his reaction be if someone asked him to describe Oswald and he would like to give an answer that was 180 degrees from the truth? The truth, in fact, would be, well, Oswald's about my height, he looks something like me.
Yeah, I get what
And
you're
he's
saying.
trying to get away as
from
far
it.
as
he
possible.
can't even suggest that for this reason. From his point of view, remember, the vulnerability, what he's talking about is not a stolen car case. He doesn't even want one person accidentally to be aroused by the suggestion, because, my God, this is the murder of President Kennedy and the subsequent butchery of Oswald. He's, no matter what his ego, Cliff, I'm suggesting he's got to disassociate at this point from the second Oswald role he played.
So the only thing I'm saying is that...
His ego he takes care of to a great extent later on. He really does. He has an ego trip.
I see.
With the help of Jenner, when the Jenner said, well, you're not really a doorman, are you? And he says, well, technically, more or less, they're about to
That's why I
agree
know-
he's an author.
Yeah, when I scanned it, his
Yeah.
testimony, you can see it. And that's
But-
one of the reasons why I contend that, being that he was known in the, he was known to be an associate of Oswald, or having known Oswald, or officially, it's rational for me to say that he would admit that he couldn't even remember his height.
Well, now, that would
I
be
know- I
a
know he
possible,
actually did.
that would be a possible reply. I'm just suggesting, like Gaeton, that the one thing he would not be able to do casually, he would do almost anything, even if he were cool, except to say that, oh, Oswald is about the same height I was, about the same weight, looked pretty much like me. And by that time, there's been speculation by critics about the second Oswald. I'm not even, I don't know if that book was out until the following year, the second Oswald, but the speculation is out, and he's encountered it, and he's got to disassociate, and I suggest that you would too. You could satisfy your ego at other points, but you would say he was a good deal shorter than me.
We're talking about 4 years. Supposedly hadn't seen him in 4 years, and only saw him for a short period.
A lot of inches. A lot of inches.
But we're talking about,
four.
wait just a minute, we're talking about a guy that we know, saw him a few months ago, and knew then, as he knew before, that he's the same height. He's also playing the role not only of being a different looking person, in effect, but of not having seen him for some years. So he might have a secondary motive of not remembering too well. Well, that just shows you how I feel like it. The most likely answer is a need to disassociate, but it could be the other. In any case, it was one or the other in terms of probability, because, for example, I'm 6'6", and if I were to meet a man briefly who was 6'6" and talk to him, I would have no feeling afterwards that he was 6 inches shorter than me. It would be quite,
You recall how tall Jerry Patrick Henry was?
very tall, but I haven't seen him in years. I would say he was about 6 feet. He was very heavy, a bit on the flabby side. Looks like he might have been muscular. But I only saw him at one time, but if I had to recall, I would say 6'5" and about 240.
You're going to say 4'11".
Huh? Oh, you're funny. You're a great comedian. But was he around that? He's pretty big, isn't he? Very big. Yeah. But that would be like me recalling Jerry Patrick Hemming, who is about my size, as saying a rather short fellow with 5'9" or something like that. It's just not digestible. Anyway, to get on with this, the interview with John Spencer of 1824 Dauphine Street. This was a landlord of Carey Thornley, and again, because this is available to you, Cliff, because this is available, I won't go into great detail, but I will read a few of the critical lines. Incidentally, when Thornley, did they say they had no coffee? Was that it?
She's making some now.
Oh, okay. Incidentally, with regard to Thornley's veracity, you'll notice in the Warren Commission, he testifies that he's not married. That's a divorce, he's not married. Spencer, in his statement, says, when Thornley lived there with Jean Hack, whom Thornley said was his wife. You've got the note already to try and find Jean Hack, good source of information. Spencer, the landlord, said that on the night of the assassination around 8, the Secret Service came to his door asking for Carey Thornley. Well, the next morning, he directed them to the restaurant, Arnold's. The next morning, the FBI also came in to interviewed Thornley for quite some time. That might be a good point to a lengthy interview from them. I'd like to see what questions they would have that would be lengthy. If his answer to them was that he hadn't seen Oswald since that time, you know, they have a kind of pattern of making those interviews awfully short in this case. Why would they speak to him for a long time? But anyway, I'd like to see it. But here's the important thing. Thornley, you recall, in his gratuitous affidavit, among the ways he edges the facts in his favor indicates that he went to the Washington area in December. Spencer, the landlord, in this 1967 interview, recalls that about 2 or 3 days after the assassination, he found a note in his mailbox from Thornley. Thornley doesn't even have time to talk to him. You got that? I mean, doesn't even have, it's just several days after the assassination. Thornley has been in New Orleans since early 1961. The assassination occurs. And within several days, his landlord finds a note from Thornley saying, I must leave. I am going to the Washington, D.C. area, probably Alexandria, Virginia. I'll send you my address so you can forward my mail. Spencer said it was quite unexpected, as Thornley had at least 10 days left in the month before his rent would have been due. That from the way the note was written, he got the impression that Thornley was under some pressure and for some reason had to leave. Well, the rest of this, we just go down to the description of the apartment. Spencer said that after the note, he went to Thornley's apartment, which was apartment C, and every bit of paper in the apartment was torn up in little bitty pieces resembling confetti. Thornley had even watered down the paper so that the ink was blurred, preventing anybody from reading any part of it. This is not your normal departure to move to another city, but these weren't normal times for Thornley. Before Thornley left, he informed Spencer that NBC has surfaced in several other ways in the last few days. Might have to start making a list of the ways they've surfaced. NBC had offered him a large amount of money for the last chapter of his book, The Idle Warrior. You notice a pattern of rewards we've seen. The 4 men who ended up in Galveston, they were all rewarded in different ways. Ferry and Bobuff, within a few months, have a gas station. You have Breck Wall jumping from Dallas to become a headliner at the Thunderbird, and you have the 4th one, Melvin Coffey, going to work for Michoud at NASA. There's a pattern of rewards we see, and it just occurs to me that perhaps a nice way to take care of Thornley, if he's performed, is to have NBC offer him a large amount of money for the last chapter of his book, The Idle Warrior. The negative pregnant, to go backwards, where the value there is not simply that we're accumulating another case of a man being rewarded. We see that pattern, but that the inference is that Thornley has performed a substantial service for some structure or group. That's the significant thing. They're talking about a large amount of money, because Thornley was of the opinion that he was going to be a rich man because of the coincidence of Oswald being the subject of his book and the assassination and arrest and murder of Oswald. Incidentally, the point was made the other day that although a number of individuals played roles in the assassination, as an example, let's say Ruth Payne, clearly a member of the intelligence community, is functioning as a babysitter for the Oswald family. It's clear that many of these people are being manipulated, doing what they have to do. There's no reason to presume, for example, that Ruth Payne and Michael Payne knew what was going to happen, and I think it's most unlikely. But the point I'm getting to is a great many people whose services are available because of their relationship to the clandestine structure here involved. Most of them have no way of knowing precisely what is down at the end of the road. But one person who might gain early recognition of what's down the end of the road would be the person playing the second Oswald. He wouldn't have to be acting out too many scenarios before he could smell what was coming. For one thing, he would be noticing immediately, if he were in touch with Oswald, which Thornley is, he would be noticing immediately that they are not telling Oswald that he's playing Oswald's part. And that alone would be very meaningful to anybody with an intelligence background. He obviously has been told not to tell Oswald. They perhaps has reached a point where they don't even have to tell it. But I'm suggesting that unlike so many people whose services are utilized because they are in the intelligence community and have to perform, and not free to say anything about it. The one person who might see what's coming up would be the one playing the second Oswald, acting out the scapegoat's part. And he, the man who's the strongest candidate for that role, happens to be the one person who, before the assassination, has written a book about Lee Harvey Oswald. It's interesting to consider his reasons for I asked him in the grand jury how he happened to be writing a book about, he described Oswald pretty much the way he did here, as a rather rabid man, with regard to his left-wing Marxist politics, but essentially he described him as a nebbish. In other words, less than the average Marine, a mediocre Marine, and yet when he was asked by me how he happened to write a book before the assassination about the man who allegedly was the assassin, he said because he was such an interesting character. But that doesn't fit, because Oswald was not a particularly interesting character, certainly not the type you'd write a book about. That brings me to one other thought. I don't know at the moment how important this is, but I underlined in his testimony before the Warren Commission his statement that he finished the book in early 1962. That does not coincide with my recollection. I'm pretty sure that in the last few days, some of the material we've gone over, whether it's the letters from Thornley or whatever, indicate that by
April.
63, by April 63,
1st, yeah, he started.
April, he's still pounding away.
Started it.
He started it.
He said he started the book in April.
That's
He
it.
started the book on April Fool's Day.
All right, that's it. That's right, and that led us to a discussion of the shooting, briefly, of the shooting of General Walker. But here's the point: this is the kind of conflict you want to make a mental note of and try and resolve. Just as Cliff asked, why did he make Oswald shorter? This is such a distinct alteration of his testimony, a distinct conflict in the facts, that you've got to wonder which one is true, but B, more importantly, why does he have to come up with two different stories? Before the Warren Commission, he says that he finished the book in 1962, and yet in a letter we saw to a friend, he's only begun it in 1963. That again is the kind of thing that is likely to be meaningful if we can figure out the reason. I'll throw out a reason right now. It occurs to me that, well, if I had to pick which one's true, I'd say it would seem more likely that he started the book in the spring of '63, because only by the spring of '63 would he, in terms of probability, be able to perceive a pattern of what was going to be happening to Oswald. Oswald is down the road by then, as far as being set up in different ways, but there are still many things to be done, and they lie ahead. Whereas in '62, it would not have been apparent to Thornley that Oswald was going to be the patsy. That seems to me to make '63 the most likely time. On the other hand, I cannot find a reason why later, in this testimony, which is in April 8, 1964, why at a later date he should find it necessary to push the writing of the book not merely a year earlier, but having been completed the year previously.
I can't buy your first reasoning, because the book is about the idle warrior, as it were, about his, I would take it, his Marine Corps experience. Oswald as the idle warrior. So the theme of the book would encompass a time that really had nothing to do with Oswald's operational behavior.
That I would agree, except that he says...
And I'm not taking Thornley's book as something serious.
Yeah.
You're giving it a kind of validity, I think.
I see what you mean. Maybe it was just a book about the Marines that doesn't deserve that much attention, and are you suggesting he made it, indicated it was a book about Oswald? Later on, when he sees Oswald is headed for the
Well, I think that's a possibility, because in that way, it could account for some of the detailed recollection he would have of Oswald and his opinions and his thoughts.
Okay. All right, go ahead, finish.
Well, that to me would account if he, when he came before the Warren Commission for...
Well, then, is this what you're saying? Then, to begin with, even assuming that I'm right, and this is a pretty rotten human who has done what I think he did, you are suggesting the possibility that the writing of the book could have been unrelated to any function of Thornley's, and just be something he started in '62 about the Marines in general, innocently, so to speak. Is that what you're suggesting? Perhaps later.
No, I think that's, whether or not he actually started the book in '62 is irrelevant. But the fact that he said he started the book in '62 would have been relevant in terms of his Warren Commission testimony. We don't know whether he really started the book in '62, but if he said he started the book in '62, well, then the Warren Commission could say, well, that explains the fact that you picked Oswald.
Oh, wait,
that
no,
explains...
no, I think you've helped me. I think you've helped me see why he set the date back. In his letter to a friend in April of 1963, he says, I'm starting my book. If about that time, or soon after, even if he didn't have that in mind when he started the book, he begins to receive assignments to pose with guns and play out other scenarios with regard to being the second Oswald, then it may well be that the following year, when he's asked when he started the book, he might want to push it back that he finished it in '62 because it was really written about the Marines, not about Oswald. It might be a little too strong to be saying he's writing a book in advance about Lee Harvey Oswald. Is that what you're saying?
Continue the arguments about
That it was a book about the Marines.
I guess it is.
And pushing it back makes
I
it more
can
remote.
answer it in one question.
Is that your point?
Okay.
Important to keep in mind the nature of his precipitate departure from his apartment, the message to the landlord saying I'm going to the Washington, D.C. area, and the watering and tearing up of all the paper, and above all, I think it's important, Cliff, to keep in mind that his indication to Spencer that NBC had offered him a large amount of money for the last chapter of his book, The Idle Warrior, because we have come across an indication of a systematic payment of people who have engaged in unusual activity along the perimeter of the assassination. Sometimes the activity hasn't always been clear, but it's been associated, if it hasn't, it's been associated in time, like Ferry's trip to Galveston. In any case, this would be one way of Thornley being rewarded, and he certainly expects to be because he says he's going to be a rich man. That's about the end of the significance of the Spencer interview. The other one I'm going to do very quickly, the next memo, is the interview with Harvey Wade. I came across Harvey Wade in trying to track down the heavyset Latin whom we seem to be encountering as consistently as the escort of Oswald and handing out pamphlets, among other things. And
This interview with Boxley.
Boxley conducted this. Some of Boxley's, in other words, I'll tell you that in a minute. But anyway, I was trying to see if this Latin, who had a scar in his left eye, in the eyebrow, according to the description of many individuals, well, let's say a number of individuals, ended up in Dallas, and ultimately, after going through enough of the documents in the Warren Commission, I came across the FBI interview with Harvey Wade, in which he described being at the carousel one night and seeing a man who resembled Oswald, seeing two men. One resembled Oswald. He thought 5'8", apparently sitting down, 140 pounds, and He wore the hair parted on the left side and had an immature or baby expression around his mouth and chin. Estimated the age to have been in his early 20s. The number 2 man he described as 5'10", tall, stocky build, oval face, of Mexican or Spanish extraction with a 1-inch scar on his left eyebrow, and said he also had a noticeably pox-marked face. Did you say Frank Sturgis had pockmarks or not? He doesn't. He did have the scar, but no pockmarks. Anyway, I sent Bill Boxley to speak to Wade in Chattanooga, and no, he did it by telephone. I thought I had him go there. The reason this is in the Thornley file is because if you look at the photographs of Kerry Thornley, there's a very unique characteristic he has. I don't know if he has it anymore, I doubt it, but he really has what you would call an immature baby face to an unusual extent. I think you all have seen these examples. Incidentally, it would just take a second. I don't think we've shown Cliff how his face compares on the body holding the rifles.
Yeah, we did.
Did you see it? Did you see that fat lip?
Yeah.
And the shadow it makes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't you think that's interesting?
Very interesting.
Naturally, you can't reach a conclusion at that point, but you've got something. He's not eliminated like Oswald is, for example. He's still in business. That's the thing. Every time you